Clarity on Fire, a podcast for people who know what they don't want out of their life and career, but aren't sure what they'd rather be doing.
In a world where it's easy to exist, but hard to feel alive, we, Kristen
and Rachel,
2 certified life and career coaches, are here to help you cut through the information overload, get unstuck, and focus not just on how you can have a career you're passionate about, but how to create a whole life that feels fulfilling.
So join us here, where we serve up inspiration and down-to-earth wisdom in a way that only 2 best friends can.
We want you to experience the relief of knowing that, yes, you're allowed to want more out of your life and career.
And no, you don't have to wander through the dark anymore. Our job is to light the fire that shows you the way. Let's go.
Hello.
Hey.
Someone recently told me this was their favorite part of the podcast. I always
book
like
club?
that. Yeah.
Well, okay, I was going to say it's mine, but I've said that about too many other segments.
You're lying.
They're going to not believe me anymore. But I do love a good book club.
I do like that people find this enjoyable because we don't do it very often. Maybe that's why she likes it, because it's more of a rarity. Only do it, 3 or 4 times a year when there are 5 Fridays in a month. So
I have a lot of clients, too, who will go read the book, and then they're all excited and they want to talk about it. So I know people getting excited about whatever books we're going to share. And this is a really, really important one.
We should have done better at telling people we were reading this so then they could go read it before we... That's kind of the point of a book club, is tell people we don't really do a good job of that.
No, we don't.
Maybe we'll... It's usually like, surprise, we read a book. And you guys are like, cool. I could have read that if you'd let me know you were going to read that. We're really bad at having a book club. I am now realizing. So
an introvert's problem for a book club.
Yeah, sometimes
keep it inside.
Sometimes I mention it, but sometimes I don't. So I think what we'll do from now on, and now that I'm saying it, I will do it because that's
accountability.
Yes. We will say at the beginning of a book club month, maybe the first step, maybe that Dear Rachel episode, like the first Friday of the month, we will let you know what book we're reading at the end of the month. That way you could go listen or read it if you want to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Give you a few weeks.
So this month we are reading I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austen Channing Brown, which is a book you've probably heard of because she has been everywhere.
Yes.
Talking about her book. I have not yet listened to the episode that she just recorded with Brene Brown because I was like, okay, if I listen to that, I'm just going to copy paste everything Brene says and I'm going to sound like a Brene poser. So I'm going to listen to it after we record
I listened to just the beginning of it because I wanted to hear... They're friends, and so it was really fun to hear their dynamic.
Okay.
And one of the things that I really resonated with that Brene said, she was like, I know a book is good when I throw it across the room multiple times while reading it. And she was like, I call those books, I say they have wings because they fly across the room. And she's like, your book is all dinged up. She's like, that's how I know it's really good and really important.
I love that she said that because let's just dive into this book. Because that's so funny because my very first point is exactly that. So clearly Brene Brown and I think alike.
NBT.
The first chapter is called White People Are Exhausting, which I flinched when I read that before I even read a single word of that chapter. I went, oh, I don't want to be exhausting. Just immediately I was like, oh, that feels bad. And then I was like, oh, well, that's why I'm reading this book. But yeah. And so I guess before we dive in, I just want to set some ground rules for this conversation. One is, I don't want you guys to listen to 2 white women talking about a book a black woman wrote and then decide, I've heard enough.
No, this is not a replacement for hearing her story from her. We're going to give you a lot of her words, but I want you to go read the book the way she intended it to be read. Absolutely.
Listen to it.
This is no replacement for reading her story.
I read it, you listened to it.
Yes.
That's usually what happens, by the way.
Yes.
Kristen listens to the book because she can't read it fast enough for my taste.
I don't know. I think I'm a pretty auditory learner too, so it works well for me.
I think you can multitask. That's why you can get it done faster. You have a hard time.
I don't, though, when it's important in a book like this. You
actually sit and just listen to it? Mm-hmm. What do you do with your hands? We're getting on a tangent here.
Yeah. I mean, I might wash dishes or something very mindless, but...
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, first of all, this is not supposed to be a replacement for you taking in the book. It's more supposed to get you excited and interested in the subject matter and in any book club we do. It should be an encouragement for you to explore it more.
We also want to look at this not through the lens of trying to explain her story to you, but
she
more
can do that
so
herself.
Exactly. That's the last thing she needs.
Like, we also, almost every point, we're just quoting her because, like, why would I try to summarize her words? I'm just going to tell you what she said.
But we do want to look at some of the concepts in this book through a coaching lens. Some of the themes that come up a lot in coaching that she is really good at articulating and touching on, and we want to look at it in that way.
I mean, yeah. And that's not the only lens I experienced this book through, because obviously I experienced it through, like, oh, I'm a white person reading this book. I experienced it through that lens. But I did also experience it through a coaching, like, oh, she's reframing things for me, which is like a big coaching tool lens. Yep. And so I want to use some of what I feel like she was able to do for me. In a way, she was kind of like coaching me inadvertently as I was reading this book. I want to help you guys experience some of what she's saying through a coaching lens too, because I think that'll help you take it in on another level, you know? So let's dive in. Okay, so yeah, the first point was, this is not, you're supposed to be triggered.
This is not a comfortable book to read.
No, that, like, the point is you read it because it makes you uncomfortable, but if you can sit with discomfort long enough, it'll transform you.
Yes.
And if you don't take it super personally, which we'll get to that, it'll transform you. So.
Yes. So one of the stories that Austen starts out telling.
It's kind of like it's like the first big story of her and experiencing racism and realizing that's what it was.
Yes. So her name is Austen, of course, and that's typically more of a boy's name. So she was often mistaken.
A white boy's name.
Exactly. It's a much more commonly a white boy's name than a black girl's name.
Yes.
So she has many experiences over her life of being thought of as a boy. But one in particular
the substitute teacher would be like doing attendance, and they would she'd have to like stand up and jump up and down to be seen because the substitute teacher would be looking for a white boy, not a black girl.
Right. But she has one particular instance where it just feels very different. So she has an encounter at the library. She's a huge book nerd, so I love it. And it really, really changed her worldview. The librarian cannot believe that library card belongs to her. She keeps asking, is this your library? Are you sure?
She's 7 years old. Card? She's old enough to know that it's her library card.
She's like, I know my name. But this woman cannot believe and thinks, there's almost this suspicious air of, where'd you get that library card?
Yeah.
So I want to read you a little bit about this section. I just wanted to set the stage.
Yeah.
So how did I know this wasn't more of the same? The woman's suspicion. Because after I answered her question about my little library card, I was still not believed. I could not have explained it at the time, but I knew this was about more than me just not being a boy. Why did you give me this name? I demanded, letting my books fall loudly on the table next to us. My mother, probably wondering how she'd managed to raise a little Judy Blume character of her own, started retelling the story of my grandmother and the Austen family. But I cut her off. Mama, I know how you came up with my name, but why did you choose it? She walked me over to a set of scratchy green armchairs and started talking in a slow, soothing voice. Austen, your father and I had a really hard time coming up with a name that we both liked. One of us thought to use your grandmother's maiden name, her last name before she married your grandfather. I already knew this part of the story, so I swung my legs impatiently, waiting for her to tell me more. As we said it aloud, we loved it, she continued. We knew that anyone who saw it before meeting you would assume you are a white man. One day, you will have to apply for jobs. We just wanted to make sure you would make it to the interview. My mother watched my face, waiting for a reaction. My brain scrolled through all the times a stranger had said my name, but wasn't talking to me. In every instance, the intended target had been not only a boy, but a white boy. I didn't understand my mother's point about job applications. To that point, the only application I'd ever filled out was probably for the library card in my hand. But one thing became clear. People's reaction to my name wasn't just about my gender. It was also about my brown skin. My legs stilled. That's why the librarian hadn't believed me. She didn't know a name like Austen could be stretched wide enough to cloak a little black girl.
That's going to be like every time we read a point. Like,
I know.
Oof, it's like a punch to the gut just reading about it. So then how much worse is it when it's you?
I know.
And like what I was thinking when I read that was, okay, so have you ever had the experience of your parents having to name you something so that people will take you seriously? No.
Just to give you a fighting chance
Like,
in the world.
No.
My parents didn't have to think about that.
My parents didn't
when
have to
they
think
named
about
me.
that. I've never had to think about that.
Never had to think about that. That was very eye-opening and just kind of punched me in the gut. Like, wow, yeah, that's what it takes to be taken, to just be compared to everyone else in the race for a job or for whatever.
In the race. That's weird word choice. In the competition.
True. In the competition, exactly.
So, okay, the next thing I want to read is really long. It's like a couple pages, but when I was looking at it, I was like, I don't want to cut any of this out, so I'm not going to. And I think it encapsulates the exhausting thing. Like I started with sharing white people are exhausting because I want to explain, or I want you to try to get the idea of what exhausting means. That right there is an example of it. It's exhausting to have to keep explaining why your name is your name.
Yes.
It's exhausting to keep having to explain yourself, and it's exhausting that your parents would even have to name you something so that you could be taken seriously. So, her parents were successful. Like, unfortunately, it worked. Naming her Austin did get her interviews, and then people would be surprised that she was there because of her name. So, she says, I can't speak for every Black woman navigating white culture, but this is how being hired usually unfolds for me. First, I'm given a promise, usually from a supervisor, coworker, or member of the hiring committee, that she's a safe person for me to talk to if anything racist happens. To make the promise of safety feel genuine, she admits that the organization isn't perfect and assures me that I can share if there's ever an inappropriate comment or a wrong word. That way, the problem can be addressed. Second, I'm given a brief account of the organization's imperfections, a series of stories involving elusive people who no longer belong to the organization. The stories usually concern examples of missteps, the time a white person misspoke in a board meeting or when a racist email was intercepted by leadership. But they end on a note of hope, expressing how the organization reacted. We invited insert name of famous Black person to speak at our annual lunch. We launched an 8-week discussion group on book by Black author. But within my first few weeks of working there, the organization's stereotypes, biases, or prejudices begin to emerge. Comments about my hair, accolades for being surprisingly articulate or particularly entertaining, requests to be more Black in my speech, questions about single moms, the hood, Black on Black crime, and other topics I'm supposed to know all about because I'm Black. So I bring up the incidents with my safe person, the one who said she wants to know about these encounters. But the response is some version of, perhaps you misunderstood, or I'm sure he didn't mean it like that. Oftentimes, the responsibility to extend compassion falls on me. You really ought to go back to talk to him. Perhaps if you were more patient, you could see his heart. So I move on. Rather than dwell on individuals, I speak about the system, about white boardrooms and white leadership teams, about white culture and the organization's habit of hiring people who perpetuate that culture rather than diversify it. But the white consensus doesn't want me to point out these things. I was only supposed to name the bad apples, so now whiteness has a few names for me: divisive, negative, toxic. I feel disappointed. I'd hoped that this organization, this group of people might be different from the last one, that they would understand what it means to embody an organization's diversity in more than numbers. But instead of giving up, I take a step back. I return to pointing out the bad apples, hoping that my doing so will lead others to see the systemic. I talk about the woman who touched my hair without permission and the man who called me colored in the hallway. I talk about how when I walk into our church, people still ask me if I'm looking for the food pantry, how they greet me as a newcomer every Sunday, even though I haven't changed my seat in 2 years. I'm not interested in getting anyone in trouble. I'm trying to clarify what it's like to exist in a Black body in an organization that doesn't understand it's not only Christian, but white. But instead of offering empathy and action, whiteness finds new names for me and offers ominous advice. I'm too sensitive, and I should be careful with what I report. I'm too angry, and I should watch my tone when I talk about my experiences. I'm too inflexible and should learn to offer more grace to people who are really trying. It's exhausting.
That was the feeling that just felt like it emanated from this whole book. And it was exhausting to hear these stories. I can't imagine how exhausting it must be to live this every day.
one of those experiences is just like another little weight and
Yes.
another little weight. And some of them are big weights.
And then every time you hope it's going to be different, and then it's not.
Also, to me, it's very gaslighting to be told, like, you are in a situation where you cannot win and that you are being gaslit when every problem that you call out is put back on your sensitivity.
Or diminished to the point that they try to make it sound like it wasn't even a problem.
It wasn't.
That
right.
is gaslighting.
That is gaslighting. So a lot of you are familiar with gaslighting just, in terms of relationships or maybe your relationship with your boss. But just like think about the gaslighting that exists like in almost every space you walk into. And then how do you maintain a sense of self and a sense of strength and a sense of hope and a sense of happiness? Like that, it becomes so much a current you have to swim so much harder against, or even just to get to a state of neutrality.
Yes.
That is the definition of exhausting.
Yes. Yeah. It's exhausting to have to keep pointing it out. It's exhausting to keep getting things diminished. It's exhausting to be told your perspective is either flawed or you're doing something wrong when you know in your heart
you need
that's
to
not
contort
true.
yourself into a pretzel to make the person who's doing something wrong understand you.
Right.
Ooh.
It's so much responsibility, and responsibility is exhausting. Like that much
It's a burden.
responsibility is a burden. Yes.
We're not done talking about what's exhausting.
This one is both exhausting and heartbreaking. This just
Well, everything is pretty, it's all kind of heartbreaking, but
this story that I'm about to read you was just, really broke my heart. Okay, I'll just jump right in. Following my dad through the toy section of the party store, I picked up a little trinket that caught my attention. Don't even think about it, he said, shooting me down before I could debate whether or not to ask him to buy it. I sighed, put the trinket back, and stuffed my hands in the pockets of my overalls, willing myself not to be tempted again. My father glanced back at me, but when he noticed my little fists bulging from my pockets, he stopped in the middle of the aisle and turned all the way around. Don't do that, he said sternly. Do what? I wondered to myself. I had long ago learned to tame my smart mouth with my dad. Was he now reading my mind? Don't ever do that, he repeated more softly this time, bending his 6'2" frame toward me to let me know I wasn't in trouble. But I was still confused. What had I done wrong? Even if you put it back on the shelf, Austin, you can't touch store products and then put your hands in your pockets, he explained as his large hand gently removed mine from their denim hiding place. Someone might notice and assume you were trying to steal. I nodded. It took some time, but eventually I trained myself not to touch my pockets, and nowadays my purse, when walking through store aisles.
You ever done that?
Oh, probably a million times when I was a kid.
Oh, no, I mean, did your parents ever tell you not to do that?
Never. It wouldn't have crossed their minds. It didn't cross my mind. This is not something that my family worried about.
No. Like, that's an experience that was completely foreign.
It's these small moments that it just, wrenches you because you're like, every kid does this.
Every kid does that. Of course. They're like, I want this toy. Kids steal crap all the time when they're really little and don't even realize that it's wrong.
Right.
And it's just the presumption of innocence that's given to white people. You don't even realize it, right?
That's why it was so heartbreaking. It's just a little kid who loves a trinket in a store and now has to think about, am I going to be perceived as a criminal?
Right. And her mom, and we didn't write this part down, but her mom on the next page, taught her you always have to keep receipts to make sure that you can prove you paid for something. That's not something.
And never open something in the store.
Right.
Like she learned all these lessons.
There's all these rules.
Yes. Just to make sure you don't get anywhere close to even a hint of suspicion.
It's exhausting that you have to live according to a very different set of rules that don't apply to other people.
Yes, that's exhausting, and nothing is fair about that.
All right, hold on. There's a good passage here about, so we talked about it's exhausting at work, it's exhausting being a kid, it's exhausting going to school. So resisting an education built on a white worldview meant constantly having to evaluate the risks of telling the truth or furthering the myth. Would I write that Christopher Columbus discovered America? Would I do the report on Malcolm X instead of Mark Twain? My parents left the decision to me. I could choose the better grade, or I could choose to affirm Blackness. It's a decision many students of color have to make. Sometimes I just stated the truth. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, but the land he discovered was already inhabited. Other times, I'd give the answer the teacher wanted with a disclaimer. Our textbook states that. I won't lie, I kind of enjoyed being more right than my teachers, even if it cost me half a letter grade.
I can't believe
I never had to make the choice between like honoring my own value and getting good grades.
Right.
Never had to make that choice. Never even occurred to me.
And it breaks my heart that she would get a lower letter grade for saying something that
is that quote unquote controversial. It's not actually controversial,
but that
everything she's saying is
true.
Actually true.
It's true.
I know
but it's not the way we tell the story.
That's another example of gaslighting.
Exactly.
That you get penalized for telling the truth.
Because that's not the story we
other people get rewarded for perpetuating the myth.
Yes.
Ooh, we're going to talk about anger in a minute. If you're mad... Oh, Kristen's throwing things. She's so mad. She's throwing things.
We've got books and papers.
So we wanted to exhaust you because it is exhausting. And I think you like, that's how do you empathize unless you kind of can sit in someone's experience for a little bit?
You can be told
and experience just how fucking exhausting that is.
But these stories start to paint a picture of moment after moment after moment. And the accumulation of all of those things, you can just feel the exhaustion weigh in. So I want to also get into how Austen had trouble fitting in. So for a long time, when she went to school, for much of her education, she was pretty much the only Black kid, one of few.
Like a couple
Black kids. It was mostly
kids.
white kids in her classes. And then in the summers, she would go spend those with her dad in a mostly Black neighborhood, which felt like a culture shock to her. That was not her normal experience.
Than like, the white people in wherever she was, Vermont. I mean, like some
it was a private school, I think.
Some like bougie place, right? Like, oh gosh.
So she was told that she was too Black for the white kids, but too white for the Black kids.
And she also said, I had bad acne and a boy's name. It was not a good time in my life.
I mean, no wonder she didn't feel like she belonged anywhere. Everywhere she felt like an outsider.
Yeah.
And then as a teen, she found a place where she finally felt like she belonged, which was the church. Specifically, that was in her first encounter with a Black church. So I want to read you a little bit about that. 36. I looked up into the choir stand, filled with brown faces like mine. The choir director moved her hands up and down in unison. Every member paid close attention to what she was doing. I later learned that this was because we rarely sang any song the same way twice. She wasn't just conducting pre-written music. She created a whole new song for us every time. We rewarded her with shouts of "Sing choir" and our own melody of hallelujahs. That day, I fell in love. I fell in love with the soaring voices and the songs that moved us to tears and then chased the blues away. I fell in love with peppermint-dealing church mothers and hymn-singing deacons. I fell in love with fiery preaching that moved so deep it would undergird you and push you to your feet in praise. I fell in love with a Jesus who saw the poor and sick and hurting, a Jesus who had bigger plans for me than keeping me a virgin, a Jesus who loved and reveled in our Blackness. After so many years of not belonging, to find a place like that, I can imagine was
celebrating
like, I can
who we
breathe
are
here.
Yes, we're celebrating who we are. We're uplifting who we are. We're not apologizing for who we are. We're not feeling exhausted by who we are. We're not being told to be anything else. It's like, the deep breath you would take would be kind of phenomenal at that juncture in your life. And so it's not surprising that a lot of her work has been in ministry and has been in the church. So that's a running theme throughout this book, is that she is a Christian with a capital C. She loves Jesus. She loves Black Jesus, which I love. First of all, I love the idea of Black Jesus. I do too. I love
it. Again, not to just like say everything Brene says, but she was like, I don't know if I'm allowed, Austen, but I want to worship Black Jesus. She was like, I want the whole world to worship Black Jesus.
If I were to cast someone to play like Black Jesus Christ Superstar. Oh, John Legend already played him in the... Yes. So that's awesome. Karamo from Queer Eye. Can he be Black Jesus? He's gay too. I just feel like gay Black Jesus.
I love it.
I love it. Yeah. So anyway, I'm glad Brene liked that too, because I was like, I love it. I know
Brene was like, am I allowed? And she was like, yes,
he
everyone
sounds so
is
much
allowed.
more welcoming and warm than white Jesus, to be honest, or at least the conception of white Jesus you learn about in church, right?
Exactly.
So anyway, she's a super spiritual religious person, and so she works in a lot of churches and she does a lot of ministry. So a lot of this book from here on out is about the tension she feels between her, devotion to God and to Jesus, but also the ways that racism seeps into that thing that she loves more than anything, and how she reconciles that kind of within herself while also being determined to heal the system. And it's really heartbreaking because she loves this thing so much, and yet there's a lot wrong with it, because the church, even, she has that space in like a Black church, but so much of church-led organizations, nonprofits, and ministries are white-led. And so there's this really profound sort of disconnect between the church valuing, harmony and unity. And in doing that, they're not willing to confront some of the ugly underbelly of the racism that's inherent in the church, too.
And she takes on that work many, many times. But you can also see how that's another source of exhaustion.
It takes a toll on her.
Especially in the place that is usually the place she belongs the most. Even that sometimes becomes exhausting.
I think in the church, there's this undercurrent of, we don't see race, right? Everyone is one. And we'll get back to like the church more later, but that's a thing that happens in other institutions too. And she talks about it in relation to her school. So, and something in particular that happened there. So I remember a religion class toward the end of my senior year when our teacher asked the students about our future plans. Most of us were bound for college in the fall, so the conversation gravitated toward talk of applications, scholarships, and possible majors, a discussion that led one white classmate to air her grievances about not being accepted to the University of Michigan. Rather than chalking it up to the sheer number of applicants U of M must receive in any given year, she had a different explanation. A Black person must have taken her place. And not a Black person who perhaps had above average test scores, or who'd completed more hours of community service, or perhaps had written a stronger biographical essay on the application. Had this been her assumption about the Black people who earned spots at the university, I probably could have forgiven her. But alas, her explanation was short. Because of affirmative action, Black people took my spot. Her spot. Or if I were to add all that was left unspoken in her sentence, if the University of Michigan hadn't let unqualified Black people in, I, who am obviously deserving and qualified above and beyond those people, would have easily been accepted. My blood boiled. I really wanted to hurt her feelings. I wanted to suggest that perhaps she was not as qualified as any of the students who were let in, Black or otherwise. I wanted to tell her that if I was one of the applicants, I knew for a fact I'd get in before her, and it had nothing to do with my skin color. I wanted to tell her that no one stole anything from her. That's what made it an application. Our teacher completely froze as the tension climbed. But more concerning was that 4 years at a racially diverse school hadn't been enough to challenge my classmates' belief that whiteness on its own merit made her more deserving. Our school's racial harmony might not have created that assumption, but it didn't help her unlearn it either. A lack of confrontation had done her no favors. As high school came to an end, I took this lesson with me and became determined always to question what looks like unity at first glance. This is so, so important. Harmony is not all that it's cracked up to be.
And confrontation
confrontation is valuable. I have so many points about this later on in the conversation, but this is so important.
This is a theme of the book too.
Yeah.
That oftentimes when things look fine or harmonious or peaceful on the outside, it doesn't necessarily mean there's not an underbelly.
Yeah, it's insidious.
Yes.
Harmony and unity are values that on the surface look really great, but on the inside might be masking something really kind of freaking ugly and insidious and destructive.
Mm-hmm. So here's, along that same point, I want to bring up something else you said that really got to the core. Somewhere along the way, I picked up the unspoken belief that I was made for white people. That might sound weird, but it's true. Much of my teaching and learning managed to resolve around whiteness. White privilege, white ignorance, white shame, the things white folks needed in order to believe racial justice is a worthy cause. Movie discussions on Do the Right Thing or Crash often focused on the white characters, and privilege walks focused on making white people recognize the unearned advantages they'd gotten at birth. I worked as if white folks were at the center, the great hope, the linchpin, the key to racial justice and reconciliation. And so I contorted myself to be a voice that white folks would hear. It's amazing how white supremacy even invades programs aimed at seeking racial reconciliation.
Boom. Fucking boom on this one. Because this to me is like the definition of insidious, is that even the things aimed at dismantling racism cater to white people.
Which is so meta.
But like this is the conversation you hear all the time. And I have something about this, I think, later on, about how we are always so worried about we gotta say this in a way that the white person's gonna be able to accept. Or say this in a way that your prickly old white uncle is going to be able to maybe let his guard down and understand. The question is, why are we so concerned with saying it in a way that's going to make a white person comfortable?
And she fell into this trap too.
Well, right, exactly. Well,
she found herself being like, well, I want to get my point across. I guess I have to, in order to do that.
And these are the people in charge and at the top.
Right.
I guess that's how it has to be. I do not.
But it still takes the focus away from what it's supposed to be on in the first place.
Yes.
So this was very eye-opening.
That to me is like potentially one of the most important points. I mean, I don't know. You guys get to decide what's the most important thing to take away.
I think they're all really important
but like
points.
That just really, really, really hits home that just because someone says they value unity and harmony doesn't actually mean that it's not catering to whiteness and actually kind of racist in its anti-racism.
I know.
So, to that end, this happens a lot when companies talk about their diversity and inclusion efforts, right? She says, companies love talking about their diversity and inclusion efforts, but I remember one unusually frank conversation with our organization's board of directors in which I learned how those efforts often work. Less than a year into the job, I was seeking approval for a new racial diversity training program. I knew the meeting wasn't going well when the treasurer said, well, just to play devil's advocate, and then posed a series of questions, speaking so gently as to preserve an air of innocence. Why don't we want assimilation? Isn't that the point of an organization's culture? Don't we want to bring in people of diverse backgrounds and then become one unified organization? My mouth dropped open, but the rest of my body froze. I had no idea how to speak truth to the person who held my program in his hands. How could I possibly explain that the unity he desired always came at my expense? I'd worked for a number of organizations that struggled to create meaningful opportunities for people of color, but I'd never heard anyone make an overt case in favor of assimilation, particularly at an organization that promoted diversity in its mission statements and messaging. Granted, many people of color on our team had grown suspicious of those statements, suspecting that the organization wanted our racial diversity without our diversity of thought and culture. I just never imagined someone with his influence would say it aloud and with positivity.
I'm like, assimilation is the opposite of diversity.
Oh my God.
That means you want everyone essentially to subscribe to the same characteristics or the same philosophies, which are always white.
Hello? Right. Yes.
Why do you want diversity if you don't actually want diverse perspectives?
Yes. Diversity does not just look like, oh, we have 20% Black people and 15% Asian people at our organization. Like, diversity is we respect differences of opinion and thought, and we're willing to challenge our own opinions and thoughts and policies and perspectives.
Well, and this just gets more into that numbers piece. It's like, it's not just about the numbers. White institutions are constantly communicating how much Blackness they want. It begins with numbers. How many scholarships are being offered? How many seats are being saved for quote-unquote neighborhood kids? How many Black bodies must be present for us to have good diversity numbers? How many people of color are needed for the website, the commercials, the pamphlets? But numbers are only the beginning. Whiteness constantly polices the expressions of Blackness allowed within its walls, attempting to accrue no more than what's necessary to affirm itself. It wants us to sing the celebratory "We Shall Overcome" during MLK Day but doesn't want to hear the indicting lyrics of Strange Fruit. It wants to see a Black person seated at the table, but doesn't want to hear a dissenting viewpoint. It wants to pat itself on the back for helping poor Black folks through missions or urban projects, but has no interest in learning from Black people's wisdom, talent, and spiritual depth. Whiteness wants enough Blackness to affirm the goodness of whiteness, the progressiveness of whiteness, the open-heartedness of whiteness. Whiteness likes a trickle of Blackness, but only that which can be controlled.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this in organizations.
Oh, I've 100%
this
seen that.
rang so true because I was like, oh my God, she's so right.
Yes.
That's what it gets down to is like, we need more Black hires or we need more Black managers or we need more
But
Black
God forbid that Black person then think differently or behave differently or have a different viewpoint or bring up something controversial.
And she's saying, like, obviously you do want more people of color at any table, but not...
The number alone is not the point.
The number.
No, the number alone is not the point. And it's so true that we want to feel like we're good. And so we're going to do this, which is self-fucking-centered.
Bringing in people of color to make white people feel better.
Hello.
What is happening?
All right. So we've talked about how racism is exhausting. We've talked about how
institutions, spiritual or companies, how they
just because you want harmony, just because you want harmony and diversity and unity doesn't actually mean that it's not fucking racist. But potentially, if you're just asking me, I think one of the worst offenses is when you try to disguise love and compassion. Well, when you try to disguise racism as love and compassion. That to me is the thing that makes me the most angry. So I'm going to pull up. We got a couple of quotes about this because I'm fired up about it. Rather than having a conversation about policy or assumptions or interactions, I'm asked about what God thinks of me. This is convenient because it allows the people in charge to wash their hands of the conflict. But the suggestion that I assimilate doesn't always come passive-aggressively or with ill intent. Sometimes it sounds loving. It's been a hard week at the office. Because I work at a Christian organization, my coworkers ask if they can pray for me. I'm moved that they've noticed my emotional distress. They gather around, lay their hands on my shoulders. I close my eyes and breathe deeply, listening to their words. But before I know it, the prayers take a turn. They're no longer about my circumstances, but about me. They ask not that I would be understood, but that I would find it within myself to give more grace. The prayers don't ask that doors would open for me. They ask that God would gift me with skills they wish I had. These prayers aren't for me. The prayers are that I would become who they want me to be. Lord, make this Black person just like us. Like, that to me is the most fucking offensive thing we've gotten into yet. Because they don't even realize it. They don't realize they're doing that, which is not an excuse. Please know that is not an excuse. Like, they don't even realize just how deeply that seeped into their DNA, that they're praying that she would be changed, not that there's nothing wrong with her, and that her, her circumstances just need changing.
I know. What broke my heart the most is she's sitting down and she's like, oh, this is what I need. This is a relief. They see me. They're here for me. And then the whole thing just got so warped. It's like we can't even pray for the right things here.
Yes, right. Like, it literally invades prayer and what is seemingly on the surface compassion and empathy and love. And so I think it's so important to check, we'll get into this in a minute, but like to check that impulse in yourself, right? Just because you care, just because you have empathy or compassion for someone doesn't mean that that your underlying thoughts or your intention actually are pure, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then this next one. I am not a person who is often filled with rage. This filled me with rage.
Some white man screamed at her for 20 minutes.
So some white man comes in late to her seminar, first of all.
About race.
Yeah. And doesn't even hear all of it. And then at the end, yells at her for 20 minutes. I mean, I'm telling you, he is a combination of like mansplaining, and I don't know if like white-splaining is a thing, but it probably is.
And just straight up,
he's like white-splaining race to her
Right.
like yelling at her for 20 minutes. And then here's what happened. That day I cried. I knew I had done nothing wrong, but my body was still processing the onslaught of anger and condescension. I willed my body to relax, removing my hands from the table and crossing them in front of my chest, a feeble attempt to stop from shaking. I knew more than that man did all the things he considered himself an expert on. Black boys, the hood, the nonprofits, working on issues of crime, poverty, and education. But instead of recognizing that I am flesh, blood, emotion, real, a human, he had taken all these things for granted, speaking to me in a way that he wouldn't have to anyone who looked like him. This is partly what makes the white fragility of whiteness so damn dangerous. It ignores the personhood of people of color and instead makes the feelings of whiteness the most important thing. It happens in classes and workshops, board meetings and staff meetings, via email and social media, but it takes other forms too. If Black people are dying in the street, we must consult with white feelings before naming the evils of police brutality. If white family members are being racist, we must take Grandpa's feelings into account before we proclaim our objections to such speech. If an organization's policies are discriminatory and harmful, then that can only be corrected if we ensure white people won't feel bad about the change. White fragility protects whiteness and forces Black people to fend for themselves. I should have said it even before I read this. Everyone else's response after this man yelled at her was at first to be like, well, maybe you could have responded to him differently. Maybe you could have taken him to a separate room and calmed him down. Maybe you could have used a different tone. Maybe until someone was like, wait a minute.
That wasn't her job.
This was not her fault.
Nor was it her job to tend to his emotions.
The response was still, how can we take care of the angry, vitriolic white person in the room and forget the fact that maybe he's not the one who needs taken care of in this moment.
That is the takeaway here. Is that the angry white people or the sad white people or the hurt feelings white people do not need to be taken care of. Okay? It doesn't matter. We do not need every single person who's white, whose feelings have been hurt, to get on board before change gets made. If you're going to make change, it's going to create dissonance, it's going to create discomfort, and those people are going to have to use that as an opportunity to go inward, or they're not.
Or they're not.
But catering to them is not necessary or healthy. Is racist. So, okay, here's the thing. Most of us hear about, like, the angry white man in the room, and we're like, well, thank God I'm not that guy, right? Like, I'm not that. I'm a nice person. Well, hold on a second, because I'm coming for you nice people. You know how I felt about nice people before, and now we're going to amp it up a little bit.
Oh, man. She had a whole section about nice white people, and this one I was like, I know Brene was also like, ooh, man, this one, probably she threw the book on this one.
In my experience, white people who believe they're safe often prove dangerous when that identity is challenged. This is in part because most white people still believe that they are good, and the true racists are easy to spot. The true racists wouldn't have hired me, wouldn't have brought me on this trip, wouldn't have noticed the homogenous environment. My colleagues were much too nice to be racists. I don't know where this belief comes from, but I do know it has consequences. When you believe niceness disproves the presence of racism, it's easy to start believing bigotry is rare and that the label racist should be applied only to mean-spirited, intentional acts of discrimination. The problem with this framework, besides being a gross misunderstanding of how racism operates in systems and structures enabled by nice people, is that it obligates me to be nice in return, rather than truthful. I'm expected to come closer to the racists, be nicer to them, coddle them. Even more, if most white people are good, innocent, lovely folks who are just angry or scared or ignorant, it naturally follows that whenever racial tension arises, I must be the problem. I'm not kind enough, patient enough, warm enough. I don't have enough understanding for the white heart, white feelings, white needs. It doesn't matter that I don't always feel like teaching white people through my pain, through the disappointment of allies who gave up and collaborators who left. It does not matter that the well-intentioned questions hurt my feelings or that the decisions made in all-white meetings affect me differently than they do everyone else. If my feelings do not fit the narrative of white innocence and goodness, the burden of change gets placed on me.
I know this is hard because I think I don't think us here were talking to many of the angry.
No, we're talking to
people.
the nice people.
We're talking to the nice people.
People who think they're good. The people who
Yes.
think I haven't done anything wrong. But the problem, okay, hold on, I'm about to go off. The problem is that when you equate racism or the lack thereof to morality or the lack thereof, then you cannot acknowledge your own internalized racism without feeling like you're a bad person. And you don't want to be a bad person, so you can't be a racist.
Okay, I want to tell you something that Austin said to Brene that struck me so deeply, which was...
go ahead.
You can be a good person and you could still be a better person.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
She's like, yeah, you might be a good person. Don't stop there.
But that's...
You can be a good person who is not always doing good things and has room for improvement.
I think as you and I have realized lately, what gets in the way is shame.
Yes.
And equating racism to morality is the problem, because what happens is you think racism equals bad, and I'm not bad, I'm good. So if someone calls out internalized racism in you, you feel shame because you're like, I'm not bad, I can't be bad. And then you're not willing to let in anything that person says or open your heart or your mind, because in doing so, you think you're going to have to admit I'm a bad person. That's the fallacy. Glennon Doyle, our last book club, she had a whole chapter in her book about confronting her own, as a white woman, internalized racism. And what she said is what helped her to realize, oh, I'm not a bad person. I'm just someone who's breathed in the toxic fumes because I live in a culture where it's everywhere, was I've also internalized a shit ton of misogyny, but I don't feel bad about that. Mm-hmm. I just realize it's there and I work against it. Like the misogyny of feeling like I have to be the skinniest, prettiest, blondest, most attractive woman on the block, or, thinking that I deserve less because I'm a woman. These are things that I've just internalized. Mm-hmm. You've internalized racism too without realizing it. We all have. And so it's not that you're morally a bad person.
Yes.
But as long as you think that's what it means, you're not going to have an open heart or mind, and it's going to be very hard for you to change.
Right. It's a normal reaction to have shame at that realization, but it's actually a really unhelpful reaction. We're going to have a whole section here in a second about shame. That one really hit home for me. But I want to read something else to you on our way to that. White people desperately want to believe that only the lonely, isolated, whites-only club members are racist. This is why the word racist offends nice white people so deeply. It challenges their self-identification as good people. Sadly, most white people are more worried about being called racist than about whether or not their actions are in fact racist or harmful. Can we just
pause for a second on that?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Read it again. Brene Brown always makes you read it. Read it again. That's important.
Yes.
Just that part.
Sadly, most white people are more worried about being called racist than about whether or not their actions are in fact racist or harmful.
Uh-huh. I mean, that is one of those things that I'm sure Brene Brown wanted to throw the book on, because that challenges me too. I hear that and I'm like, oh yeah.
Yes.
White people, we are very concerned about not wanting to be perceived as racist.
Of that, yes.
If we used as much energy to actually combat racism as we do worrying about whether we are racist, we'd get a lot done. Yes, and also, that really gives away how fucked up our mentality is a lot of the time.
Because that's about you and your own discomfort.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But the truth is, even the monsters, the Klan members, the faces in the lynch mob, the murderers who bombed churches, they all had friends and family members. Each one of them was connected to people who would testify that they had good hearts. They had families who loved them, friends who came over for dinner, churches where they made small talk with the pastor after service. The monster always has been well-dressed and well-loved.
This really sat with me because, again, you hear this. You hear, well, he's a good person. No, that is completely and utterly irrelevant to whether or not that man is also racist or is also doing something harmful or has internalized racism and or prejudice and doesn't even realize he's doing it. Those are two totally different things. From now on, I do not want to hear ever again. I mean, I'm going to hear it because I live in the world. But I don't want to hear this absolutely ridiculous argument that he's a good person, so therefore he can't be racist. Those are two totally different things.
Yep. Even Klan members had friends who thought they were good people.
Right. Everyone has family who would attest to he's a nice person or he's done nice things. As if someone who is acting in a racist way can't have been generous ever in his life.
Right.
It makes
we make these things all or nothing.
Right.
And we don't like to live in the gray area, but you have to if you're ever going to actually improve and grow and make this a more just society.
So when white people start to realize kind of our complicity and we start to take ownership of some of the ways in which we have internalized racism or we've acted in, racist ways, mostly unbeknownst, naturally you start to feel guilty. And that's okay. That's like a very normal human reaction.
Sure.
And it is super important that you understand how to handle your guilt appropriately. So at a conference, Austen had a bunch of white people kind of come up to her after a seminar and confess their wrongdoings, which is a pretty normal kind of stereotypical thing that happens, is that white people will start to unload about, I didn't know, and then I did this one time. Right.
Yeah.
So she says, after I heard all of these confessions, it felt personal. It felt like I was sitting at the table when the racist joke was made and the confessor said nothing. It felt like I was in the home with the Confederate flag that bothered no one else but me. It felt that way because for every confessor, my body had become the stand-in for the actual people who'd been harmed in those situations. I was left with the weight of those moments I hadn't experienced. I was expected to offer absolution, but I am not a priest for the white soul.
Oh, okay. I'm going to pull up Brene here. Can you say that again?
I am not a priest for the white soul. I have more to say. I'm going to continue. The more tired I get, the more I have to unglue myself from these offensive, painful stories for which white people expect an absolution I cannot give. They want me to tell them it's okay and give them a handy excuse for their behavior. Youth, ignorance, innocence, anything to make them feel better. White people really want this to be what reconciliation means. A black person forgiving them for one racist sin. But just as I cannot make myself responsible for the transformation of white people, neither can I offer relief for their souls. So, I don't offer confessions like these anymore. Nowadays, when someone confesses about their racist uncle or that time they said the N-word, I determine to offer a challenge toward transformation. For most confessions, this is as simple as asking, so what are you going to do differently? The question lifts the weight off my shoulders and forces the person to move forward, resisting the easy comfort of having spoken the confession. The person could, of course, dissolve into excuses, but at that point, the weight of that decision belongs to them, not me.
There is so much good stuff in this that I want to pull out. First of all, when Austen has to hear these confessions from all these different people, it's like she's getting re-traumatized over and over, but for things that weren't even hers. Yeah. So that, just to keep with the theme, has got to be exhausting, first of all.
Yes.
Also, and this resonated so much for me. Maybe it's like the type 9, like, natural guilt and shame that I'm opposed to.
You have been guilty of this in relation to me. I don't know what you're about to say, but I think you're guilty of this.
Oh, I know I'm guilty of this. This is, I'll blame it partially on my type. I think it's also just like partially my nature. But guilt feels so awful that oftentimes what you try to do, and this is what she's saying in this example, is you hot potato your guilt onto someone else.
You hot potato your pain onto another person.
Oh, this feels so bad. Let me relieve myself by putting this on someone else. But it sounds good. It feels like, oh, I'm sharing this. I'm getting this off my chest. I'm trying to absolve my sins. But you're just giving that to somebody else. And now Austen has to walk away and feel that pain that you just put on her to unload yourself. Yeah. So that is actually a selfish act. And that has taken me a long time to recognize within myself. I think I'm so glad she's calling it out because I see this happen a lot. Yeah. Around this topic and around so many topics. Yeah.
So it's super important to examine your intention and potentially find a more appropriate outlet for your confession. I'm not saying don't make it. I'm saying maybe make it to a white person. Someone like a trusted friend who could talk you through that, or a therapist or a coach or something. But maybe don't expect every Black person to be your confessor. That's not
Right.
That's not their job.
No, that's exhausting for them. And the last point that just drove this home so much to me was that Austen decided to reframe this. So you could just
put that right back on you when you bring that to her.
In your guilt, in your shame, and you could confess it and make it sound like, oh, I'm growing because I'm confessing my sins, and stop there.
Confession implies that you are absolved as soon as you say something.
Exactly.
Which is, like, forgive me for dissing any Catholic right now. I'm not sure how that's really how sin works, quote unquote, sin.
Right.
Is that as soon as you just, like, tell someone and that person says, you're fine, that means you don't have to do anything anymore. No. Confessing it is not enough. And what Austen said was, what are you going to do about it?
What are you going to do instead?
Your words don't mean much if they're not backed up by action.
Which is maybe you don't even necessarily need to go around absolving yourself of your sins by confessing to everyone. Maybe you just need to ask yourself that question.
Yeah.
Wow, I noticed this behavior within myself. I'm not proud of that. I feel guilty about that. I jumped to conclusions, or I had a thought that was racist. And instead ask yourself, what do I want to do instead? What would be a more productive thing for me to do?
Do you guys hear the thunder in the background?
It's really coming down.
Really loud. It's about to...
Emphasizing our points.
It's Jesus. It's Black Jesus. He's applauding this book. Okay. So, we're getting to my absolute favorite part of this book, which is the conversation about, you guys aren't going to be surprised, rage. It's exhausting and draining to try to navigate a world where, for Austen, it's exhausting to be a Black woman navigating the world, but it's more than exhausting. It's rage-inducing.
Yes. So here's a little snippet. I also feel something when we are dying on the streets, when we are derided for our bodies, even as white women trying to imitate them, when feminism is limited to the needs of whiteness, or when Blackness is used for profit without acknowledging the brilliance of the creators. I feel something when a white woman mocks the body of Serena Williams by stuffing padding in her skirt and top. When First Lady Michelle Obama is called a monkey. When 9 men and women are murdered in a church because they are Black. I feel anger. Even more frustrating, there are so few acceptable occasions for my rage to be expressed. Because I am a Black person, my anger is considered dangerous, explosive, and unwarranted. Because I am a woman, my anger supposedly reveals an emotional problem or gets dismissed as a temporary state that will go away once I choose to be rational. Because I am a Christian, my anger is dismissed as a character flaw, showing just how far I have turned from Jesus. Real Christians are nice, kind, forgiving, and anger is none of those things. I know you want to be on a soapbox about this one,
well, we have more thoughts.
Let her rip.
We have more thoughts about anger to share, but just that's how you control another person and manipulate another person, is for any emotional experience they have to be wrong. Like, it's so manipulative that anytime she feels anger, it must not be correct because she's a woman or because she's Black or because she's Christian.
Right. And think about it coming from multiple places.
The directions.
It's not even like it's just one. She's not allowed to be angry for so many aspects of who she is. So like she said, where can she possibly express this if her color or her gender or her spirituality is constantly reining her anger in?
So... okay, here's a really interesting way that she sort of approaches anger now that she kind of learned how to deal with it. She said, I was more afraid of my own rage than I realized. I tried to be the wise, patient teacher, the composed one. I tried to wear an air of unbotheredness, standing on something akin to moral superiority. But ultimately, these were attempts at self-restriction. I left my humanity at the door. Then Audre Lorde saved me. In her book, Sister Outsider, Lord wrote an essay entitled The Uses of Anger. She writes that anger is not a shortcoming to be denied, but a creative force that tells us when something is wrong. Every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger potentially useful against those oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought that anger into being. Focused with precision, it can become a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. Anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification. A sense of freedom fell over me as I read those words. Anger is not inherently destructive. My anger can be a force for good. My anger can be creative and imaginative, seeing a better world that doesn't yet exist. It can fuel a righteous movement toward justice and freedom. I don't need to fear my own anger. I don't have to be afraid of myself. I'm not mild-mannered. I'm passionate and strong and clear-eyed and focused on continuing the legacy of proclaiming the human dignity of Black bodies.
I love this definition of anger because it uses it as a creative force. She uses anger and creativity side by side, which is not something I would have thought of before. I thought that was so wise because if you think about it, when you're getting really enraged about something, it's because you see something's wrong and you can't help but then start to wonder, what would be right? What would be a different way of doing this? And you end up creating, at least at first in your mind and eventually maybe in the world, a new reality. Fascinating.
Can you please read my favorite part of this whole book? Starts right there. I'm pointing to the part. Read it.
It was hard at first, trusting my voice of anger. But Black life is full of opportunities to practice. And so I did. I wrote, and I spoke, and I engaged with others, and then I wrote some more. Just like Lord promised, my anger led to creativity, to connections with others who were angry too. My anger didn't destroy me. It did not leave me alone and desolate. On the contrary, my anger undergirded my calling, my vocation. It gave me the courage to say hard things and to write like Black lives are on the line. It shouldn't have surprised me. I serve a God who experienced and expressed anger. One of the most meaningful passages of Scripture for me is found in the New Testament, where Jesus leads a one-man protest inside the temple walls. Jesus shouts at the corrupt temple officials, overturns furniture, sets animals free, blocks the doorways with his body, and carries a weapon, a whip, through the place. Jesus throws folks out the building, and in doing so, creates space for those most marginalized to come in: the poor, the wounded, the children. I imagine the next day's newspapers called Jesus' anger destructive, but I think those without power would have said that his anger led to freedom: the freedom of belonging, the freedom of healing, and the freedom of participating as full members in God's house.
Jesus.
I love this story too, actually.
I love it.
It's so different from many of the other stories you hear about
Have you ever
Jesus.
heard that story in church?
I
about
had.
Jesus?
I went to Sunday school like for years and years and years.
Well,
and
if I
heard
did,
that
I forgot
but
it.
That's not the one that you hear the most. That's for sure.
No, Jesus with a whip is my Jesus. That's my Jesus, guys.
Yes, absolutely.
So I love this for so many reasons because Jesus, if you're a Christian, which Kristen and I were raised as Christians, not that we're like practicing Christians necessarily now, but Jesus is the embodiment of love and all things that are good. And so for the embodiment of love and all things that are good to be pissed the fuck off and to come into a space with a whip and basically riot. Jesus rioted, and he was the embodiment of love and good. And you want to know what? Yes, the newspapers would have, I was going to say crucified Jesus. Well,
Ooh,
yep,
that happened too.
Yeah, that's the point. Right? Is that that's someone who speaks that much truth and is that angry is dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
People don't like anger because it makes them really uncomfortable. And this is what, when Martin Luther King talks about how he's so disappointed in the white moderate, and one of the things that he says is that he cannot abide with people who say, I support your beliefs, but I cannot condone your actions, is he's saying there is no polite way to seek justice, because asking people to be polite in the name of justice is always supporting the side of the oppressor, right? Like,
and
if you could get justice in a polite way, we would already have had it.
It makes it seem like the anger that's behind it is unwarranted.
Right. Anger is always just representative of, like, how fucked up a situation is, right? Like, anger is always in direct proportion to a wound. Yes. So when people are really angry, it's because they're really wounded. And so to tell them to not be angry is to deny their humanity. And so Jesus knew what was
there's
up
probably
with
a really good reason why they are wounded in that moment.
So I love that because I'm like, guys, if Jesus can flip some tables and take a whip in there and just like set people to task, then you can too. And also, you need to check yourself before you get uncomfortable with other people's anger, because sometimes anger is the embodiment of love. Speaking of Jesus, Austin is probably going to be so excited if not that she's ever going to hear this. Sorry, Austin, you're too cool for us. But I feel like she's going to be excited to hear that I really like Jesus more after reading this book. I feel like she would be very happy to hear that. Okay. Fortunately, she says, Jesus doesn't need all white people to get on board before justice and reconciliation can be achieved. For me, this is freedom. Freedom to tell the truth. Freedom to create. Freedom to teach and write without burdening myself with the expectation that I can change anyone. It has also shifted my focus. Rather than making white people's reactions the linchpin that holds racial justice together, I am free to link arms with those who are already being transformed. Because at no point in America's history did all white people come together to correct racial injustice. At no point did all white people decide chattel slavery should end. At no point did all white people decide we should listen to the freedom fighters, end segregation, and enact the right of Black Americans to vote. At no point have all white people gotten together and agreed to the equitable treatment of Black people. And yet there has been change over time, over generations, over history. The march toward change has been grueling, but it is real. And all it's ever taken was the transformed, the people of color confronting past and present to imagine a new future, and the handful of white people willing to release indifference and join the struggle. I really, really like that, because what I really hate it, is like those old white people on Fox News who are like, we love Martin Luther King. I'm like, boy, shut the fuck up. Because I know for a fact, if you were an adult in 1962 and you're acting the way that you act now, you would have been one of the, I think, 70% of white people who disapproved of Martin Luther King at the time.
Yeah.
It is the biggest crock o' shit that people think that because society has sort of gotten to a certain place that, like, that means that they don't have to do any more work, or that they don't have to be any more, like, self-aware. It's like they were carried by the current, and now they're expected to behave a certain way because otherwise it's really inflammatory and egregious. But I do not believe for a second that those people, like, wouldn't be behaving differently if the rules were different.
Yeah. Again, to quote Austin again, you can be good, but you could be better. Society could be better than it was, but it could still be a lot better.
Yeah.
We can't rest on any kind of laurels if they're already to rest on.
No. Okay, we're going to end on a powerful note.
Okay. This is toward the very end of the book. I'm not interested in love that is aloof, in a love that refuses hard work, instead demanding a bite-sized education that doesn't transform anything, in a love that qualifies the statement Black Lives Matter because it is unconvinced that this is true. I'm not interested in a love that refuses to see systems and structures of injustice, preferring to ask itself only about personal intentions. This aloof kind of love is useless to me. I need a love that is troubled by injustice, a love that is provoked to anger when Black folks, including our children, lie dead in the streets. A love that can no longer be concerned with tone because it is concerned with life. A love that has no tolerance for hate, no excuses for racist decisions, no contentment in the status quo. I need a love that is fierce in its resilience and sacrifice. I need a love that chooses justice. Again, what are you going to do about it? if you see it, what are you going to do about it?
Love and justice are synonymous. In fact, who was it? Was it Martin Luther King? Was it John Lewis? I can't remember. I'm sorry. This is bad. I should know this. But I love the quote that justice is what love looks like in public.
Yeah.
Like on a big platform, that's what it, like that in action, justice is what love looks like in action.
That's so good.
Right?
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to end on that.
That's what she's saying.
Yes. Yeah. Like, and I think that speaks so much to her experience as a Christian, right? Like feeling like somehow love and justice were not synonymous because justice can be angry and justice can be ugly too. And like love shouldn't be those things. Well, no, love is those things too. Mm-hmm. And in fact, sometimes you have to get really ugly and really angry in order to do something loving. Mm-hmm. And so...
And I like to end on this one too, because I feel like it's a call to action for all of us. I feel like it's a call to, okay, if I really feel loving and I want to be a compassionate, empathic person, what does that mean? How do I demonstrate that? Because that's the kind of love that is needed here. Not just love of thoughts and words, but love of actions.
How do I get uncomfortable? Mm-hmm. Because that's what love requires. That's what justice requires, is that you get uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. You own up to some of your own worst tendencies or your own, invisible up until this point biases, and you work through your shame or you work through your guilt and you speak up when you see something, or you be an advocate for someone who can't be an advocate for themselves because unfortunately no one is taking them seriously. Like so many opportunities for you to get uncomfortable, and love requires discomfort. Mm-hmm. Transformation requires discomfort. I feel like we've made that point about 1 million times on this podcast.
You
just one more facet.
You can't make it enough.
It's just one more arena in which to make the same point.
Yeah, growth is uncomfortable, personal and societal and all of it. Mm-hmm. But it's necessary.
So I hope you like this. This was very, this was an enlightening book to read. It was a harder book to read than maybe any of the others we've read, just because in a lot of ways it was more personal to you and I in like a negative way.
Right.
Or a perceived negative way, just an uncomfortable way.
Please read this. Again, I don't want our
summary
to be. Yeah, I don't want our summary to be your only access to
the
this
white
book.
woman's cliff notes to the black woman's book. Not a good look.
No.
That's not what this is meant to be.
And also, we can't do this message justice in the way she can.
No, I had to leave a lot of stuff out that I really wanted to talk about. There's a lot left on the table here, though, up for discussion. That whole story about her cousin.
Yes, that was really hard.
That was really hard, but really necessary to read. A lot of stuff here that we had to leave out. So please listen to this book. It was only 4 hours on Audible. If you're pressed for time, it's actually a very short read.
It's really chock full. Obviously, we've been talking about it a long time, and we didn't even get to, many, many points. So it's really dense and chock full, but
it's actually really short.
It's actually quite short. I know. Yeah. So we really hope you'll read it or listen to it and share some of your thoughts too.
So we'd love to hear, your comments. Like, you can always comment on this episode, link in bio. Why did I say that? I don't even go on. I don't even do Instagram. It's late at night while we're recording this. And by late, I mean it's 8:40 p.m. That's just a little too late for me to normally be recording a podcast. So announcement is coming next Friday, by the way.
Some new stuff coming down the pike.
Yeah, we're bringing something back, and we will be talking about that on our episode next Friday. And we will not have a new episode on Tuesday because we don't have a new Magic 8 Ball. So you will hear us again on Friday with a new Dear Rachel.
Yes. So come back for Dear Rachel, come back for an announcement, and we will see you guys in 1 week.
Okay, bye.